Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is the Portsmouth Public Library's Local History Talk, discovering the history of your house with John Mayer. My name is Katie Chakowski. I'm the Special Collections Librarian here at the Portsmouth Public Library in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I'm also joined by my colleagues Paulina and Nicole, and we all want to thank you for being here. So let me begin with our land acknowledgement. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who call themselves Wabanaki, or people of the dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at the Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. Tonight's event will last until 8:30, and we plan to be respectful of your time. As you can see, we are offering this program both in person and online. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, we have subtitles turned on for greater accessibility, but if you'd prefer not to see them, you can toggle them off at the bottom of your Zoom window. We're also keeping everyone on Zoom muted throughout the entire event. And if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat and Paulina will read them out to John. We are recording today's event and we're testing it out. So we don't know if it will be available, but we're going to see what the results are. But tonight's event is part of our local history series. This is a monthly series we offer. And the next one is going to be on Tuesday, June 21st at 7 p.m. We're going to host Scott Bain, who's visiting from New York. He recently published a book called A Union Like Ours, the story of F.O. Matheson and Russell Cheney. Matheson was a prominent scholar of American literature, and Cheney was a well-known painter. Scott will discuss the relationship between the two and their life together at their home in Kittery. And this will also be a hybrid program, both in person here at the library and online on Zoom. Thank you. Sorry. And for those of you interested in genealogy and family history, we welcome you to join us at our monthly genealogy workshops. And the next one for this series will be this Sunday, May 15th at 2 p.m. when we'll be joined by certified genealogist Jill Morelli, who will talk about a technique for effective genealogy reports called Writing As You Go. And you can register for that event in our library calendar, which you can get to through our library website, cityofportsmouth.com/library. And we do really love to hear from you about what you'd like to see at the library in terms of programs. So if you fill an event feedback form out, we have the box right on the table over there. You can fill it out after the program, or if you're at home or you think of this later, you can fill one out on our website as well. And if you fill it out, you'll be entered to win a library book bag. The contest is only available to those who can visit the library and pick up the prize in person though. So thank you all again for joining us tonight. We're so excited for tonight's program, not only because John is a friend of the library and also a great speaker, but because it is our first local history program back in person since February 2020. So it's been quite a while. And we do thank you all for keeping your masks on throughout tonight's program. Does anyone object to the speaker, John, removing his mask during the presentation? Excellent. We just hope that will provide even greater accessibility for those who need it. So let me now introduce you to our speaker. John Mayer has over 30 years of museum experience and has worked in a variety of positions in history museums of all types. He has expertise in nonprofit administration, exhibit development, curatorial routines, care of artifact collections, and preservation of historic structures. John lives in Portsmouth with his wife, Debora, in a 200-year-old brick house. So with that, John, pass it off to you.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you, everybody, for letting me take my mask off. It'll be a lot easier for me to speak, and I appreciate that. And welcome. I'm not a huge fan of Zoom, so I'm delighted that there's an in-person audience. This will feel like, you know, deja vu a little bit. I think we do have 17 people who are on the Zoom. So we have a nice audience tonight. So Katie, thank you for the introduction. I'll jump right into this. Katie read my biography, and most of my work professionally has been in museums, curatorial or administrative. I'm not a building historian. I'm not a genealogist, so I am speaking to you as occupant of a historic house and somebody who's, immersed myself in the story of the house through those different paths. So I think you'll find some opportunities to do more with what I share, and I totally welcome your questions. My email is up on the screen. I will send you documents I have. You have my handouts, but if there are any questions at any time, please, I do welcome them. So I have a couple of goals. First, let me find my advance. I do want to make an acknowledgement to our community. I moved to Portsmouth to serve as curator of Strawberry Bank Museum, and then I became involved with the Portsmouth Advocates. I was on the board of the Portsmouth Historical Society. I have friends in many of the house museums. As I've learned about the town, I've met some pretty amazing scholars and experts in Portsmouth history. I think it's pretty remarkable how rich the community is that we are all part of. There's a few books that I asked Katie to pull, just a very small bibliography. I think we could do a 3-semester course on the bibliography of Portsmouth history. So the ones I picked, in particular, Richard Candy's book on building Portsmouth. If you don't know that book, that's an excellent starting point. This is on my bibliography. I have 2 books that I mentioned by Jim Garvin. Jim was curator at Strawberry Bank Museum. He moved on to New Hampshire Historical and then was the State Historic Preservation Officer. So both his collection of photographs, but also a book of his building Northern New England. It's an amazing overview of building technology. And on my references, you'll also see there's a list of Jim's website. He is such an amazing and gracious scholar. Much of his work is available on his website, including, I'm a big fan of brick architecture. So he's written about Portsmouth brick architecture. The article is there as well. And then there are 2 books that I included by a gentleman whose name is David Weitzman. They're published in the 1970s, and this is a little bit of an homage to when I got started in the field. I was exposed to his work very on. I just had a phone conversation with him last week. He's in his late 80s, but he was reflecting on the moment when he brought those books to life. And it was in a time when teachers were exploring new ways to get their students involved in history through non-traditional means. It certainly caught my attention, and it's something that I carry with me today. So a little bit of an introduction, and we'll talk a little bit more about Portsmouth's historical community. So I have some simple goals. I'm going to share with you the methods that I've used to do this kind of research. And because of that, I hope that you learn something, and then you leave the meeting tonight enabled and inspired to go think about your home or your community a little bit differently. And then a new part of my mission, I've just retired, is to encourage you to have fun. So do good work and have fun are the building blocks of my new program. And then the other thing I want to say is, getting back to our community, I think we could use a little bit more advocacy and work to inspire people to take more care of and think differently about our historic buildings. And as we get into the program, I think you'll hear where I'm coming from regarding that. So the program has 2 parts. The first part, I'm just going to go over some of the materials that I think are pretty familiar or common for doing a house history. I'm going to talk about where you find them and what they can do for you. After the first part, we'll take a little break, give people an opportunity to ask some questions, see how it goes, this being a hybrid program. And then the second part, it will be almost like a review. I'll share some of the things that I've learned in working on my house. So here we go, right? So I think if you hold your questions until we get to the break, then you can jump in and talk about any questions that you have. So here's the resource toolkit, if you will. So this is the core of my program. I'll be talking about deeds and city directories, census record, graveyard, which may seem like a morbid topic, but you will learn that there's a lot to that. Newspapers and obituaries, maps, the physical evidence of your house, photographs, archives, and talking with neighbors, former occupants, and more. I'm going to spill the beans. I have a friend here tonight in the audience, Bob Bradbard. His grandparents bought the house Debora and I live in 1920. And it's been a thrill listening to Bob talk about his experiences with our house. And we have a date for Bob to bring some family members to visit. Should be almost an oral interview with the tape recorder going when that happens. And I'll talk a little bit about how and why I think that's important. So these tools do different things. Some of them overlap, some of them contradict, and all of them together you have to kind of put your head around to see if you can figure out what they're telling you. So first, I will start with deeds. And I'll just ask for a show of hands here. How many people have done deed research on their homes? A few, okay, well, awesome. So welcome to deed research. This is amazing that the amount of information that is available online. And the website couldn't be easier, NewHampshireDeeds.org, and you want to go to Rockingham County and click there. And what the deeds will tell you is the history of ownership of your house. That is not the same as the history of people who live there, but it will tell you who owned the property that you're living in. On my handout, I also have a note about City of Portsmouth information as well. If you've never gone to the City of Portsmouth website, I think it's in the planning department, you can find maps that give your parcel number and tell what the deed number is. The book and page of your deed is what you will want to use to get into the deed history. So this is a screenshot of a couple pages. The one on the left is the opening screen after you've gone through the disclaimer and uploading the program if you do happen to need it. But it's basically a search page. You can put in the first and last name of someone you want to find. The more information you put in the website, the more likely you are to land someplace that you want to land. The screen on the right was a search for Sally Martin. Sally Martin was the widow of my house. And just putting her name in, you can see that there's about 12 different deeds that came up with her name. And then when you click on the deed itself, this is what will come up. This is what one of the deeds looks like at New Hampshire Deeds. This is a copy. This one, I forget, I think this one actually is for David Martin. Yeah, I'm not going to get too much in the genealogy. I think it's from about 1812. But you can see it's a handwritten deed. It's a little tricky to read. So part of deed research is buffing up your ability to read handwriting, which you take it slow and type it out. And I think you'll end up more surprised with what you have than anything. You'll see I have an arrow at the top there that's pointing to in this record where it says the book and page number. And then here's what I wanted to show you. This is what I do as a chain of deeds. So this is for a different property than our house on Cabot Street, but starting at the top, it begins in 2012 and then works all the way down to 1913. So it shows the grantee on the left and the grantor on the right. And basically it just follows the sequence of ownership from one to the other. So I think for people who are going to be doing deed research, the important thing is to have a way of recording what you found. And that's what this does. Just going across my columns here, I put the date of the transaction, who it is, who is the grantor, the person who acquired the property, the grantee, the person who sold the property, and then there's the book and the page. And then you can actually see how one goes down there. Oops, I did that backwards, I'm sorry. This is the grantee, there's the grantor, there's the grantee, so I had that inverted, I'm sorry. But Betty and Ira Dyer are there, who sold it to Deborah and I. And then there's that. So it basically jumps here to there, here to there. So you basically have a sequence of ownership. And it just tells you who owns your property. And all of this is public information. You can find it very easily. And actually going back to this search page, you can randomly or strategically put in names and date ranges. And it is incredible the amount of information that will come up. All of this has been digitized and is available from the New Hampshire Registry of Deeds in Rockingham County. Before the web, you would simply go to Brentwood, go into the office and have a list of deeds that you wanted to see, and they would pull out the copies. The originals are at the New Hampshire State Archives in Concord. So I've gone to both places. For the property that Deborah and I own on Cabot Street, there's a big file of probate information. And I could see the copies in Brentwood, but to better read it, I went to Concord and I was able to do that. So I want to just check to make sure that this makes sense. Did I do an okay job with introducing deeds to you? And this is absolutely one of the joys, if you will, because you get into language of property boundaries and ownership. It really does bring you back to olden times, I'll say. I also, if you're interested, I have these templates on their Excel spreadsheets. So if you send me an email and you would like me to send you them, I would be glad to provide them. It's simple. If you're an Excel person, all it is a 6-column document. So the next type of material I want to talk about are city directories. So in the deeds you find online, for the most part, you can do a lot of your work without leaving your home. City directories are not quite as easy. Luckily, here in the Portsmouth Public Library, in their special collections, they have copies of city directories that go back to 1821. So where a deed tells you who owned your property, a city directory will tell you who lived in the property. And really, another really amazing thing, and this is a copy of a city directory from 1851. Around that time, the directories show a street name. Here's Cabot Street. And then it just goes sequentially who was occupying the different houses on that street. So I think Vicki raised this question, following house numbers is a problem. This is 2 iterations before today. So, and part of what's interesting is this is 1851. The street our house is on Cabot Street wasn't fully developed probably until the 1880s. So there were vacant lots and not full numbers. So this is one of your sleuthing opportunities, is to look at numbers. So our number is number 6, and you can see there's a person named Daniel Canty there. The house next to us was built by a cousin of my Mardens, Robert Marden. But then looking at these other names as I go deeper into the record, it helps anchor information. So this is where you're bouncing back and forth between different source materials. These city directories could be a program unto its own. They're just wonderful documents. 1851 is great because you can find your street, you can go down a list of names, you can go deeper into the directory and find Daniel Canty, find that he was a laborer, find where he lived, find where he worked, and it just begins to develop a much deeper perspective of things. And then some of the directories, or most of the directories, have advertisements. If you're lucky, the person that you're interested will be listed as working in a particular store, and you can find some of the bling that they're using to promote them. Nobody in my house worked for J.E. Ham, but they were tailors. So it's interesting, some of the competition for them, and it's interesting to see an advertisement for that. So here's another spreadsheet. This is just one page of a spreadsheet, and it's looking at from 1864 to 1871. And I put a little asterisk where there were numbers related to our house. And I also picked this page because you can see the house numbers change when it gets up to 1871. So here, nobody was living or listed in our house. In number 6, Sarah Martin has moved next door to 5.5. I have no idea how they picked 5.5. Here, somebody has moved into our house, Thomas Neal, who was a corn and flour merchant, and John McGraw, who didn't say what he did. And then later, in 1871, we have Alfred Martin, who was a farmer, and then Charles Joy, who worked in a musical instrument store. Our house, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit, was rented. It was a tenement very early on in its history. So there was a lot of turnover of occupants. And this is just a way of keeping track of that. And I think what you're getting a sense is the more of this information you're exposed to, the more you're challenged to kind of keep a handle on it. Here is that 1851 directory, and I'm pointing to Daniel Canty because the next thing I wanted to show you are census records. So this does something really different than city directories or deeds. The census is every 10-year snapshot of who was living in your house. So this can be really confusing too, because they may not be property owners and they may not be there for very long. So finding alignment with the city directories, the deeds, and the census is a little tricky. The 1850 census, which is what I'm showing you here, luckily, I have both Sarah Martin, who was the widow of the person who built our house, and here I think she's 73 years old, and she's living in the house with 2 daughters and the child of one of her daughters. In the other half of the house is Daniel Canty, the person I showed you in the city directory, with his wife and his 2-year-old son. So I'm beginning to build this narrative around our house, and you'll hear a little bit more from me about the Martin family. Census records can be found online in a number of these genealogical websites: Ancestry.com, Heritage Quest, Family Search. If you have a library card to the Portsmouth Library, you can log in to the Portsmouth Library website from home and you can use, I think it's at Ancestry, Heritage Quiz, which is like Family Search. And that will provide access. If you just do a search, like if I search Sarah Martin, said she was 74 years old in 1850, it would call up a number of records that she is listed in. So that exercise of going online and using these online search tools is another art unto itself. But again, it's the kind of thing that just goes deeper and deeper. And this will look familiar, like with the deeds and the city directories. It's a good idea to have a template where you can track, each of the list of names that you're finding. And this is really just a transcription of the 1850 census. And full disclosure here, this is not elegant. This is one of the messy aspects of history where you really want it to line up and you hope it does. Some cases you're following the name of somebody and you thought they were in your house. You may find them and they're not in your house. It takes patience, but I want to give you hope and confidence that you can figure it out. One of the things that these census records do is the census taker gives a dwelling number and then they give a family number. And in the case of the house that I'm interested in, our house, dwelling number, you can see that there were two families that were listed in the house. So very early on, our house was divided. Census at different times captured different information. So not every census you're going to find the same amount of material. The 1850 census is pretty simple, with the name of the person, their age, their sex, their occupation, and where they were from. Later on, it'll include other statistical information that can be really pretty amazing. So, and now a little bit about graveyards. So first I want to just get a sense here. How am I doing? Guys following this okay? Is this new information? Yeah. So I didn't realize about something, oops. There's a website called findagrave.com. I've profiled Family Search, but I'll talk about Find a Grave. When I was doing curatorial work and researching objects in family histories, Find a Grave is an amazing tool that gives you birth and death dates and other, really core information about a subject. You have to have a little bit of information to find that person. You can also, like in my case, I'm dancing around a little bit about the Martins. The house that Debora and I live in was built by Daniel Martin in 1813. And one of the first things I came across was a genealogy about the Martin family. So very fortunately, there was a history of Captain Daniel Martin, the date of his passing, who his widow was, the children that they bore. So it helped quite a bit. And one of the other notes in the genealogy was Daniel Martin was buried in the North Cemetery. So this is a view of the North Cemetery. It's not Daniel Martin's burial place, but if you go to a cemetery and you walk around, not only is there an incredible amount of information that you can discover, but you'll encounter some of the amazing iconography of the period. I just think this is an amazing headstone. It's from 1790 or so, but with the weeping willow and the urn. And here's a headstone with a death angel. None of these are my Martin people. Going to findagrave.com, and here I typed in Sally Martin, and I simply put in her birth date and that she was buried in Portsmouth, Rockingham County, New Hampshire. And that hit brought up this record that shows her headstone that is in Harmony Grove Cemetery, which is on Sagamore and South Street. And it gives a little bit of her family history. It shows her husband, and shows 3 of her children. So this is confirming information for the people that you're kind of building your narrative around. You have a physical place where you can go and visit them. And I mean that seriously. It's pretty amazing to think about the people who had been in your house and to know where they're buried so you can see a little bit more about them. And the whole culture around death and how that was managed changes over time. And it's something that, you know, is worthy of study unto its own. When I was curator at Maine Historical Society, I was reading some of the journals of the Wadsworth family. And one of the daughters, I think this was an aunt to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, was describing sitting with somebody who was in what she called a death chamber, which is basically a room where this person is in her last days. And that whole process of being with them and keeping them company is something that's really different and hard to put your head around. And people thought about death as something really different than I know we do now. And I think religion has a lot to do with it. There are cultural studies about that. In the case of the Mardens, and I think I'll get to that a little bit, Sally outlived her husband by quite a bit, by almost 40 years. He died in 1816. So I think he was 36 years old when he passed, and left her completely poor. She had to sell everything that she owned. And one of the laws in New Hampshire protected her so she was able to retain 1/3 interest in the house, even though she did not have money. It was called the dower laws that protected her. The other 2/3 of the house were sold at auction, and they were bought by James Rundlet, who happened to have the big house on Middle Street that we can see from our house. So from 1818, when the auction happened, until we bought it, I mean, there was multiple families who had lived in our house from that period of time. And the story of Sally Marden is something I'd like to know a little bit more of. You can see there are 2 of her daughters who are listed here. She has Marietta Marden Simpson and Martha Marden. Martha never married. Marietta married a young tailor whose name was Charles Simpson. And you'll see a little bit about Charles Simpson. This is an amazing bit of tragic history. He died 2 months after their wedding and left Marietta a widow. Amazingly, she bore a child about 9 months after he passed, who lived with his mother and his grandmother and for the rest of Sally's life. And here, I'll show you a little bit more about that. So you find out about that sort of information by doing an obituary search, looking for newspapers, visiting our local repositories. The Portsmouth Athenaeum is amazing. The special collections here in the Portsmouth Public Library are also amazing. Here I've got a screenshot of the websites you can find online. And on the right is the search page for the collections at the Portsmouth Athenaeum. And if nothing else, one of the great places to start if your house is in Portsmouth is at the Athenaeum, because they have the records of the Portsmouth Advocates. And the Portsmouth Advocates have conducted street level surveys of many of Portsmouth streets. So you can look in a street index or by the address of your house, and you may find a record for it. This is a record for the house that Debora and I lived in, 68 Cabot Street. This picture was taken about 1975. And oops, I'll get back to this a little bit later, but it's wonderful seeing the picture from that long ago. And Bob, the TV antennas, I think you mentioned that one of your relatives was a TV fan. And so there's evidence of it. And the other thing too is here in our house, you can see there's an apartment there, there's an apartment there. And then if you were to go on Coffin's Court, there's another entrance that was yet a third apartment into our house. Here's a screenshot of some of the obituaries and also a newspaper article that was what I would call a random find by searching newspapers.com. The obituary, this, I don't know how well this is publicized, Katie. The Special Collections has an index of obituaries. So if you have the name of somebody and you see Katie, she can tell you whether they have a record of it in their microfilm. So that'll take you back as well. This actually is a printout that I made from microfilm. And then you get a paper copy of that, or you can send yourself a JPEG. This article was a find on newspapers.com, and it's from 1975, and I have no idea. I think I was looking for the Simpson family. This was published by the Small Business Association, giving credit to a long-lived company in Portsmouth called Simpson's Men's Store. So Marietta Simpson continued to work as a tailor. The widow Simpson raised a child who also became a tailor, who became a merchant tailor. And this Simpson Men's Store was 3 generations of Simpson family members who had a store. Originally, it was on Bow Street, and I need to look and see where it was located here in 1975. But that totally blew my mind. If you were to read this paper, you would get references to their life on Cabot Street, to the story of the family. So it's amazing. This obituary is from September 17th, 1816. So talks about Captain Daniel Marden passing at the age of 37. So funeral will be this afternoon. Talks about his dwelling house at Cabot Street. They're requested to attend without further invitation. So the other thing that's amazing, on Saturday last, John Clark Jr., aged 19, the apprentice of Captain Marden, he also passed. So, you know, was there a pandemic? Was it cholera? Was there some other virus? The records of healthcare in Portsmouth are not so strong. But another discovery, and I don't think I have a picture of it, in the cemetery, I came across Polly Marden, who was the consort of David Marden, who was Daniel's brother. They were partners as Masons. And David Marden's wife died about a month after Daniel did. So it just kind of evokes this wonder of what was going on in our community at that time. What was the level of healthcare? And it's difficult to find that. So that's find a grave, looking at obituaries, looking at newspapers. I think each of these things can just occupy a lot of your time, and just keeping track of what you're finding is really important. I'm going to show you some maps here, because this is yet another tool that you can use. And this can help you understand what's happening physically with your house. And I think one of the more useful handouts, if nothing else, that I've given you is a list of maps and where you can find them online, because they're wonderful documents, and maps can tell you so much about your community. This is a one map. It's actually a photocopy of a microfilm of a manuscript map that Vicki David gave me. It's a little hard to read. You'll have to trust me with this. It shows Middle Street, and this is Cabot Street in 1807. And it shows what William Cabot had in mind for the neighborhood. He owned the property and he subdivided in all these different lots. So it starts with number 1. I think our lot was number 6. Which, if you remember those house numbers, 6 Cabot was where Daniel Canty lived. 5.5 would have been next door, but I have, again, no idea what they were doing with 5.5. It runs all the way up to, I think that's State Street. This is Austin and so on. But this manuscript map is a beautiful tool. At the Portsmouth Athenaeum, they have a list of early research that was done that can give some clues at who owned it. But it just gives a sense of what was happening in the property. Katie gave a land acknowledgement, and I was thinking, should I give a land acknowledgement as well? I didn't. But when you think of maps, they really tell a story of a particular time. This is a 1675 map that shows Portsmouth. And what is so wonderful about these maps, it's before Europeans divided the land into different territories, although there are boundaries, but you can see where Portsmouth was located. And then actually, I think it lists the Wampanoags here, so it actually recognizes some of the native tribes who were occupying the landscape. So if you are interested in maps, you can dive into a rabbit hole there and just never get out. This particular map came from the Boston Public Library. I gave a reference to the Leventhal collection. A lot of their maps are digitized, and you can find some pretty amazing material. This is the 1813 map of Portsmouth. That's quite famous. And for those who know the landscape, it looks maybe a little bit familiar, you know, with the waterfront and then the core of the city and then the sort of western sprawl. Cabot Street is way over here. I don't know if the Rundlet House is shown on that, but it also has a little shaded area that shows a part of town that was damaged by fire in 1813. So I've taken, you know, zoomed in. You can actually see, here's the Rundlet House on Middle Street. You can see Cabot Street just getting developed. And there's a little index that says what the different hatching means. This is, you can't tell with this, but this is the only brick house on this street. This is another amazing map, a bird's eye view that shows Portsmouth in 1877. And it's quite a document. And it's also really unknown. People think, oh, you were up in a balloon and people drew it. It's done at the street, but it's really hard to know how they did it. Here, I'm zooming in, you can see this is right around, I think, Market Square is here, actually. This is, and then zooming in a little bit more, you can actually see some of the details of buildings that are relatively faithful. And I actually zoomed in to Cabot Street, and here is the Mayor House, and it actually has that kind of fenestration. So I'm very confident that they did a reasonable job documenting our house. And Vicki, I think this is you, right? Or this one? Yeah. Vicki's a neighbor. So it's amazing what that map does. And in my list of maps, you'll see that there are other maps as well. Some of them show property owners. So if you're able to put together a chronology of these maps, you can trace what's happening in your neighborhood and what's happening on your lot. And the most powerful tool for that are these, which are Sanborn insurance maps. And I gave a reference to those. The Library of Congress has a good inventory. I think they probably have 12 different sets of Sanborn maps. Earliest ones from about 1885, and they go up to 1950. And Sanborn maps were a tool used by insurance companies. An agent who is going to write a policy for your house would want to know, what are the risks for me to write that without having to go on the ground? So here is a key that would tell an agent what the town looked like or what the area looked like. Yellow are frame buildings, red are brick buildings. There's a nomenclature that says how many stories it is, how many windows it has, where the fire hydrants are located. All of that together tells an insurance agent what they need to know to write an insurance policy. For people who are studying their property, It's an amazing tool because from 1887 to 1950, you've got every 5 or 10 years, a map that shows how the landscape has changed. So on my handout, I have both the link to the Library of Congress, but there's also part of their website that helps you understand this, because you could take a class in reading Sanborn Maps. So the next thing I want to talk about is some physical evidence. I'm not going to get into a ton of details because every house is a little bit different. I see Bob Bradbard looking, because in the Mayer house, the Mayer Minor Martin house, we have mezuzahs on many of our doorways. And this is part of a Jewish tradition, which you give a blessing when you come in and out of the different rooms, as a part of the Torah on it. And for us to move into a federal period house, to find it covered over with this sort of Jewish object was really amazing. And then when you get into other things, like this is from 2013, I forget actually what we were working on. My wife's a paper conservator, so we've got all fragments of paper, of wallpaper that we found. This is actually probably from about 1820 or 1830. This is, you can't see it, an 1852 penny that was found behind a mantle. And there's a tradition of Masons. They often leave a coin behind the work, so it gives you a clue when something was being done. If you're, a nail historian or a builder, you can look at the different types of nails and you can get a sense of chronology. And then a clay marble. And I think we just found that in the soil area of our basement. So I'm not sure exactly who they belong to, but they're little relics. You know, the mezuzah ties into the tradition of the Jewish family that was in our house. And some of these other pieces would be decorative things. This was a surprise for us. And how did it change? And we've changed our house. Bob jaw was dropping on the floor when he walked through a kitchen area. When we were taking down a wall, we stripped it out, and then we found newspaper that had been used as building paper. So newspapers from January 1942, and it totally helped us understand when that section of the house was added. I think I have a picture of a Sanborn map that'll show the difference between that. So this is our carpenter who's just pulled off some siding. And he said, oh my God, look what we just found. And there it is, something from World War II in 1942. So that's a little bit of physical evidence that tells you about your, actually, I think I'm at a stopping point. So let me just take a pause here. I'm going to go to another screen so you can actually see what our house looks like. And I'll take any questions, if anyone has any questions now, or we'll take a deep breath and get ready for the rush to the finish. Yes?
The Sanborn insurance maps?
Yes.
That was put together by just individuals that went by and documented by walking up in the streets, and then that was sent to a central repository where they published all that information for the entire industry.
Yeah, it was a company. So I don't know how they gathered their information, but I think the Library of Congress has something like 35,000 Sanborn maps. So it must have been a collective effort to make this record. But they did do that. They gathered information of what the street looked like, and it was sent back and the maps were drawn, and they're fairly accurate. And if you have a chance to see them, the Portsmouth Athenaeum has them. Do you have? So the Special Collections here also has a Sanborn map. If you can put your hands on it, looking at the object itself, it's very exciting because anytime you're browsing a library, you're going looking for a book, but sometimes it's what's next to it. That's what you learn from, and that's really quite amazing. So that's a good question, the Sanborn maps. And there were different companies that did them. Sanborn tended to do whole neighborhoods where there were some insurance maps that only focused on like industrial sites, you know, but insurance maps as a tool are wonderful, and Sanborn Maps themselves are pretty good. And Graham in the back there, he was sharing that he does a lot of survey work, and you have to use Sanborn Maps in your work today. Yeah.
And that document he had up earlier helped a lot. And so things that were listed and a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. They will tell you about businesses that are nearby and what kind of operations are there. And in some cases, they'll tell if there's a steam engine or if there are other types of things that help you get some insight into what they're doing. Yes.
I missed this, the city directory and census records. Are those available online?
Which,
The city directory
Yeah,
and the census records.
okay. Census records, you can find them through one of the genealogy sites, like familysearch.com.
Okay.
Some of the city directories are, but I think that's one where you will be better served. And I will come and sit in special collections, and they have a run starting in 1821, and you can just go, you know, book by book and put together your spreadsheet. So the city directories, I recommend doing that as a traditional search. Okay, I'm going to zoom on here. I can't believe it, we're 50 minutes into the program. So I kind of did a before and after, or then and now, if you will. You can see our house today, and using the 1975 Portsmouth Advocates map, I tried to recreate the view, which is kind of fun. The house was covered in 1975 with ivy. I'll give my father, who's passed, credit for encouraging us to put a reef on the end of the house. And different times we've talked about taking it down, but the neighbors will have none of it. So we're a landmark on Cabot Street. So these are the kinds of questions that, you know, when I'm thinking about this stuff, I would ask myself, you know, how old is my house? Who owned my house? Who lived here? What's their story? How did the house change? How do I connect to community? And then these other ones are, you know, more about keeping track of it. So how old is your house? That's the deed research. You know, that's looking at some of the fabric of the house, looking at publications. Richard Candy's book, Building Portsmouth, gives you some ideas. But that's a really useful tool to come up with a chain of deeds and get a sense of your house. This is a holiday gift for Debora. I borrowed the style from Marblehead and made a little sign that we have on our house that gives proudly our date. I think when we bought our house, the first place I did go was the Athenaeum. And I recommend that as a stopping point, just to see what they might have as a file on your street, on a record of your house, and that might get you started with some of the information. Who owned your house? That's the deed. I'm sorry, I confuse us, I know. That's the deed research. What I have a picture of here is one of the documents that I got at the New Hampshire Archives. This is an inventory of the belongings in the Martin estate that was written in 1818. So when Daniel Martin died and he was in debt, they needed to sell all their properties and settle their estate. And part of that was generating an inventory. And I'm sorry you can't read this because it lists everything. Starts with the value of the house, which was valued at $1,000. But then the next thing, the next most valuable thing was $25 worth for the bed and the canopy that went around it. So there was not a lot of wealth in that family. And when the auction happened, James Rundlet bought the property for $325. So I recommend trip to the library, doing your deed research online, and looking at these genealogies. City directories are great tools for telling you who lived there. Here I've got my arrow pointing to Daniel Canty, and this is 1851. What's their story? This is the Polly Martin marker that's in the North Cemetery, and it lists her as a consort, which I think is just a very casual way of recognizing her marriage to David. David Martin was also a brick mason like Daniel. After his wife passed, he moved on to Boston. So he left the area. And then I have another thing, and Bob, I'm going to call you, and I don't know if you want to make any comment. I got this photograph about 2 weeks ago when Bob Bradbard came and visited. Bob was sharing some of his memories, and in particular, I love the story of Bob walking home from school, from the Cabot Street School, having lunch in the kitchen that we remodeled. And then he brought this photograph, and it's hard to remake this photograph because there's a little shed that covers that door. But I believe this is your dad, Bob?
Father would be on the left.
Yeah.
His brother, or my uncle Sam, would be the gentleman in his tie. He wanted to become a graduate of the Naval Academy. His twin sister, Dora, who was married to Walter Reiner, were the occupants of the house that sold it to the miners. And my father had 7 siblings. There's only 5 here. His sister Eva is on the right. He was married to a Marine accountant and lived in her adult life in California. And then my favorite there's 6 years difference between my father and his brother Max. That was my closest uncle. He had 4 siblings. I've been in touch with 2 of them already. Visited with Debora and John when they first bought the house, but they haven't seen the transformation that I've seen. So it's just a fascinating.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's so much that, it's just peeling apart the onion and getting deeper and deeper into the story. So I'm able to identify exactly where that door is. This is the little bracketed hood that surrounds our front door. It's looking from the backyard to Cabot Street. And, this must have been like the side entrance for the kids to get into their house. But it's the lower floor. There was a whole upper floor that had different families living on it. And it's just amazing to think of the activity that was happening in the house at that time. So Bob and I are feeling good about, if nothing else, we each are thinking, oh my God, so amazing to get connected to, family history.
Having been born brought up in Portsmouth, my mental state was from 1920 when my grandparents bought Cabot Street, and my father and his siblings growing up there, and now with my association with geography. Instead of my family's history from 1920, which opens up the fact that Cabot Street was actually built 100 years before this family bought it.
Yeah.
And it's like a serpent.
Yeah, it's great. And I'm delighted you came, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
So here is an example of 2 Sanborn maps, just as a comparison. The one on the left is from 1887, and the one on the right is from 1944. And I'm tried to profile the same area. The pink means brick. So this is our house. It's the only brick house on Cabot Street. There's a little alley that runs by it, but you can see, in 1887, there was a barn, there was a little L behind it, and then just our building. In 1944, this little side entrance has been added, and I believe the one story with a brick basement means the lower part. And then here's an addition that's built off the barn. One of the Bradford brothers was a fruit peddler. So he had a wagon and a horse, and the horse's name?
David.
So baby was hanging out in here. And it's pretty amazing to be thinking about that. So, and if you remember, I showed you that piece of newspaper from 1942. You can see that, you know, there was a change in the footprint of our house that happened. And I think that documentation ties it out. So you can get totally lost in it. And if you look at what's happening at other houses, you know, that too tells you a lot of what's happening in the neighborhood. I think this is the David house here. And I mentioned the Simpson family. So Sally Martin, the widow Martin, lived in our house until about 1850. Her cousin, Robert Martin, built this house in 1850 and 1851. And Sally, with her two daughters, moved into this house. And if you read the Simpsons menswear article, it talks about the Simpson family growing up in this house. It's really kind of amazing. So here's just some of the fabric. This is what the side entrance looked like. This was the 1944 work. Here's the 2013 modern update that we did. So we changed our house. We, you know, left piles of debris where we found stuff, but we also saved parts of the house. Here, somebody had put in a coal burner for the fireplace. They took out the original wood burning mantle and they modernized the heating system. Interesting, on the other side of our house was somebody who was a stove dealer. And I will be looking to see if I can find evidence of what they sold. In the barn, I found this really fun piece of advertisement. It had just been nailed on some boards to keep a draft out. It's from about 1920. And again, if there was somebody working in a market like the Bradford brothers were. This is for Budweiser barley malt syrup. Prohibition was happening then. Budweiser company had product that they wanted to sell and they could sell malt syrup. And then some clever people came up with a recipe so they could come up with a fermented beverage, even in spite of it. So this was in our barn and it made me smile when I found it. So I think I'm gonna stop here. There's so much more that I could tell, and I had a hard time organizing the progression. I wanted to really just go over some of the basic tools that you can use to understand your house. I hope at least you've gotten an introduction to that. And I hope maybe you can feel inspired and confident that you can go look at the story of your house and put together a narrative. A lot of this depends on what you're trying to accomplish. You know, if you just want to have a chain of deeds, that's pretty easy. If you want to write a narrative about the social history of your house, it's going to take a little bit longer, but I think nobody's going to check your work and you should feel good that it's a process. I have one last thing to leave with. I served 2 years on the Portsmouth Historic Commission, and it was excruciating. And it breaks my heart every time I see that we're losing a house. And I want to just put out there, and this is political, this is advocacy. A friend of mine had a sign that said, "And yet there are still men who in their minds and with their hands will tear down what time will never see again." How hard would it be to build a housing unit that would envelop this property and you would keep it? So some of these stories that we're discovering when we study our houses can continue to live and can continue to contribute to our sense of community that we have today. And that's a goal that I have. I hope, preservation is fraught. Preservation is the guilt, it's the thing that makes exclusive neighborhoods and keeps people out. It doesn't have to be that way. Preservation can be about community, about being places for everybody. You don't have to be dogmatic. You could put solar panels on the roof. You can save the building. You can make it a living part of your community. But if you take it away, it's gone. So I'm going to say thank you very much. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Kalina. Yay. Nicole, thank you, everyone. It's nice to be out and doing a program. I appreciate all of you for being here. I'm happy to hang around and answer questions. I don't know how we do if people on Zoom have questions. Do we want to even go there?
People on Zoom can just type it in the chat, but we haven't had anything so far.
There. Yes.
You didn't mention using church records. Some of the old church, I know a lot of churches have given the records to the Adventists.
Yes.
But most of them still hang on to some records.
That's
Most of them aren't well documented.
Yeah.
But they're there.
That's it. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. The Martins owned a pew or half a pew at the Baptist church. And we can wonder if there were any records for that. I think that's a really good thing. The Masonic Temple has a library as well. And I think Lou Minor was a Mason, and there may be some records for that. So I'm just scratching the surface. And I think, you know, when you start diving into it, you know, you can keep yourself fully occupied, and it's wonderful. I just totally like, because you meet people, you talk about it, they show you what they know. Katie and Nicole here are great. And it just, you know, sort of creates this energy around local history. It's just really important.
This is kind of a one-off.
Yeah.
But Mrs. Martin got 1/3 of her house. What does that mean? Did she just get a room?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because in the file, there was a description that described how the house was divided. So the problem I have is the walls have changed a bit and the uses have changed. So I was talking about transcribing old handwriting. So I get to transcribe old handwriting and imagine what it means on the landscape. But a couple of things I learned from that description, that there was a well on our property, and there was also a barn on the property, which I didn't think came until later on. But it does talk about, you know, she has this right to a passage and another part of the house. And I just have to kind of begin to imagine what each of the rooms were used for and see how that actually plays out.
I just imagine how awful that would be.
Yeah, no. Yeah, no, I'm sure. You know, it's, you know, trying to imagine the hardship that some people experienced. I think that she was probably a tailor as well, and she raised her daughters to follow in that, and that just projected down through the family. Yeah, it's really kind of it's powerful trying to imagine what it means when you lose your husband and you're left with all these children, and then trying to figure out how, with all the debt you have, to be able to go forward. Plumbing is another thing. I mean, you were talking about church records. Our house was built, you know, long before Portsmouth had running water. So, you know, how did they manage that? I know there was a well on the property. There must have been a privy as well. And was that a source of illness and disease? And, you know, that's just a whole nother thing. Yes.
I think the Portsmouth Advocates were formed in the 70s, 1970s, because I can remember the enthusiasm for saving some of the old buildings and moving them all to the hill.
Right.
They're now surrounded by hotels.
Yes.
Which is so unfortunate.
Right.
But a lot of the momentum for saving historic properties in Portsmouth seemed to fizzle as the 2000s came along.
Right.
And I find it very sad in Portsmouth, because if you come to Portsmouth from the north side, it doesn't even look like Portsmouth. You can't see North Church.
All the people who are living in the condominiums and the hotels think how unfortunate it is to have these old buildings surrounding their property. I mean, they've turned it on its head, and it reverberates. You know, so now that architecture is a standard that I think people are working to when they talk about, you know, what's the design that we want to achieve. I know there are people on the Historic Commission who'd be really mad at me for saying that, but I share that concern and think it's unfortunate. I think there's different ways of doing this work. So, yes.
You didn't mention much about the historic commissions. Do they have a role in keeping records, or are they really just the preservation?
No, well, I think the planning department keeps records of new projects. The planning department led a process where actually there's a big National Register overlay for Portsmouth, like much of the town is on the National Register. And you can go on the planning department website, and if you're in an older part of the town, you might find your house listed. I was looking at our listing and noticed how much bad information there is, but at least it's listed there. Yeah, the historic commission does not do that. That there are a couple of agencies I mentioned on my handouts. One is the New Hampshire Division of Historic Resources, which is the keeper of the National Register. So that's a group that we want to encourage and make sure that they're going and doing good work. They support National Register research and nominations. Another organization I brought some handouts is the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, which is a private nonprofit group that's advocating for best practices. And actually the National Trust, I was happy to see in their 2022 list of endangered properties, they're talking much more about social issues than simply good architecture. Like internment camps or places of worship are all things that preservation has become more aware about. And I think we want to encourage that. So I don't know if I really fully answered your question. Richard Candy is still active in the Portsmouth Advocates. I had a phone conversation with him, said they meet monthly. I think they meet on Zoom. They don't have a web presence. I think you have to find them on Facebook. They're aligned with the Portsmouth Historical Society, but maybe we can take over the Advocates by storm and elevate preservation practice to a whole nother level here in Portsmouth.
It might be a little broader, but there should be some history of vegetation, trees, and geologic features.
Oh,
And I don't know if that's something that
yeah.
looked at.
What do you think, Graham? Is anyone doing a natural history of New Hampshire? Yeah. Yeah.
There is an effort, I think it's Michael Griffin, who's the proprietor of the South Cemetery, to identify some of the old trees that are in the cemetery. You'll see labels.
Okay. Well, and there is a listing of historic trees. And I know, what is it? The chestnut tree by the Moffett Ladd House is one of the older trees in Portsmouth. If you walk on Austin Street by Middle, you can see a beech tree that is forlorn and very sad, but looks quite old, and a dogwood. But anyway, that's a ramble.
Because Portsmouth is a tree.
Yes.
They're a tree city.
Yeah. Yeah.
I suspect the arborist in the public works department.
Yeah.
knows something about it.
Yeah.
It's actually pretty sharp cookie, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. There's a lot to celebrate. And what is it? Is it in 2 years? It's the 400th anniversary of Portsmouth? Okay, so we better get going if we're going to make a difference. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. You know how to reach me. Please do. I love this, and I am around. So thank you. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, John. This is a great presentation. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to everyone on Zoom for tuning in. And we hope you'll sign up for our next programs, and please fill out the event feedback form if you think of it when you're at home on your computer, or you can fill out a form while you're here. Thanks again.
And May is Preservation Month, it turns out.
Yes,
So
it
the
is.
timing is good.
Happy preservation.
Yeah.